where Joseph enters the service of Pharaoh. He's now age 30. And God gives Pharaoh, I think, insight to set up a system of granaries to store grain. Joseph understands from what God is showing him that the famine will come upon all the earth and it will be extremely severe. So Joseph sets up these granaries, and during the first 7 years of abundance, they store up massive amounts of grain to the point where they can't even measure it anymore. They stop counting it. Anyway, the famine hits. It's severe. Jacob sends some of Joseph's brothers down to buy grain. And as you know, Joseph does his little tricks on his brothers. And they go back. And then later, Jacob actually moves down. Pharaoh is kind and lends wagons and animals and so forth to enable Joseph to bring his family down. So they come down in year 2 of the famine, and it's at this point where Joseph reveals himself to his brothers. Pharaoh opens up the land. He says, "Come, dwell in the fat of the land. The best of the land is before you," which is Goshen. And Goshen is kind of like the Nile River Delta portion of Egypt. If you look at a map and north is top, Goshen is kind of like the northeast part of it by the Nile River Delta. And that would be important because Egypt is dry. They need the Nile River for irrigation. The Nile River was very, very, very important to the Egyptians. It was like a life-giving force to them, to the extent that they actually had a river god. They practically worshiped the Nile River. The Nile River is 4,145 miles long. It's the longest river in the world. It's not just a little creek in your pasture. It's a very big river, very important, and they really, really needed this river. So anyway, Israel is actually invited by Pharaoh to come and settle in the land, and they do. Jacob actually lives in Egypt for 17 years before he dies at the age of 147. And then Joseph dies, age of 110. But Joseph is forward-looking. He understands God's promise. He knows that someday God will deliver them up out of Egypt and bring them up into the promised land. And he tells his brothers, "You guys carry my bones up out of here," which they did later. But now we enter an entirely different chapter. We're going to depart a time of prosperity, a time of a Hebrew-friendly government, to an entirely different government. A very drastic and abrupt change is about to happen. Now we begin an era of a hostile government, a government hostile to the God of the Hebrews. This guy is colder than ice. This is a picture of Hubbard Glacier, Alaska, and I'm really disappointed in how it washed out. It's really blue. I never knew ice could be blue. Donna Bell's shaking her head. It varies from pale to medium to dark blue. It's pretty amazing. It's beautiful. It was a chilly, drizzly, windy day when our ship got up close to the river. I'm calling this guy Pharaoh 2. They never give us the names of the Pharaoh, so I'll just call him Pharaoh 2. Well, Pharaoh 2 didn't know anything about Joseph, didn't care a lick about Joseph, probably didn't care about the history that had gone before him. Whole new situation here. This Pharaoh, Pharaoh 2, is a production-oriented guy. He likes production, and he sees the Israelites as a labor source. He likes this. On the other hand, the Israelites were just teeming. They were very fruitful. They were fulfilling God's mandate to be fruitful and multiply. They were doing this. Well, Pharaoh really liked their labor. He wanted to keep his brick factories going, full tilt. They were building for him the store cities of Pithom and Ramses. On the other hand, Pharaoh is worried, and his staff. They're worried because they see how the Israelites are multiplying, and what if the Israelite men turn on them and become their enemies? So Pharaoh attempts to eradicate the Hebrew male children. He tells the midwives to kill the male babies, and later he tells all his people, kill the Hebrew male children. They institute slavery, bitter, hard slavery. They set taskmasters over the people, and they actually had the taskmasters driving the Hebrew foremen, and the Hebrew foremen then in turn were supposed to drive their own people to get them to make bricks and work in the fields. Probably raising wheat, barley, spelt, and emmer. Well, the midwives obey God, not Pharaoh, and God rewards them for that and gives them families of their own. Moses grows up, and this is interesting how baby Moses is placed on the river. I kind of skipped over his birth. God demonstrates that he's in full control in that Moses is actually placed on the very river that Pharaoh was turning into an instrument of death. God demonstrates his power in that he is placed in a vulnerable state, but God is directing the heart of the daughter of Pharaoh, and she hears him cry, and she tells the mother, go raise this child, I'll pay you wages. And Moses grows up in Pharaoh's family, the very man who would turn against him. Moses, I think, grows up and fully appreciates more his Hebrew identity. He sees his people being oppressed. He sees an Egyptian beating a fellow Hebrew. He kills him. He realizes it's known. He flees to Midian. I was kind of wondering where Midian is. I got out a map. This was not just around the corner. I scaled it off, and it scaled off at a little over 200 miles. This guy was scared. Moses was scared to death. He went all the way across the Sinai Peninsula, clear across the Gulf of Aqaba, onto the east side of that, into Midian. That was a long way. He put a lot of distance between himself and Pharaoh. He was really scared. Well, as you know, he stays there, marries Zipporah, they have children. He lives there 40 years. God directs him to the burning bush. Pharaoh too dies. The Israelites are crying out. They're oppressed. They're in bitter slavery. And God hears. And God calls him. God calls Moses. Moses makes excuses which are pretty flimsy, almost comical in the light of the fact that Moses saw a bush that did not burn. Moses should have realized that that is a suspension of the normal laws of nature and the laws of physics, but it's lost on him. He doesn't get it. But I think God made concessions to him. I think God realized that he was kind of a toddler in his faith. And God knew that eventually Moses would grow into the man of God that God wanted him to be. And we'll see later how Moses doesn't rely on his brother Aaron so much later on. Moses' confidence soars later on. Moses is 80 years old. Aaron is 83 when they make their first appearance before Pharaoh. And I should refer to this guy as Pharaoh 3, because Pharaoh 2 has died. Well, they make their request to Pharaoh, which God commanded them to relay. And of course, Pharaoh doesn't take kindly to that. Pharaoh is very disrespectful toward God and mocks God, basically. Refuses the request. Who is the Lord?